I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Alex Jordan and Courtney Rawlings of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. They are the hosts of the official podcast of the Quincy Institute, Always at War. We'll be talking about U.S. foreign policy, international relations, multipolarity, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and, of course, Gaza. Also want to let you know that in the next few days and weeks, you'll be hearing more on the Russia-Ukraine conflict from varying points of view. There will be an episode coming out at some point with Emir Krupik, a longtime listener of the show from Ukraine, who wanted to provide pushback against what he would probably call Ukraine skeptics. I also have Tom Much coming on to discuss his book, The Dogs of Mariupol. So for those who may not agree with my guest's take on this episode about Russia-Ukraine, there will be other episodes coming up that offer an alternative viewpoint. I myself have been very conflicted on Ukraine, especially because of my own Ukrainian heritage. And of course, much of the conversation you'll hear, which was recorded, I would say, in late July, is going to deal with Gaza, the way that U.S. politicians have done little to hold Israel accountable. I mean, we're seeing Gaza starving right now. It's a horror show. We'll be talking about that for a large portion of the conversation and much, much more. So without any further ado, let's get right to it with Courtney Rawlings and Alex Jordan. Welcome to Parallax Views. Two guests I'm very happy to be speaking with. Alex Jordan and Courtney Rawlings of the Always at War podcast, which is the official podcast of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. This has been a long time in the making because I wanted to have Alex on. As soon as I heard about the podcast, I like a lot of the work that Quincy is doing. And maybe we could just talk a little bit about both of your backgrounds. Do you want to start, Alex?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, first off, thanks so much for having us on, JG. I've listened to Parallax for a long time and had the pleasure of working with you on getting some Quincy folks on the show. And just really appreciate the forum to talk about our perspective on American interventionism and American foreign policy. So yeah, my background, I came to the Quincy Institute from the sort of democratic political world. First job out of college was working on a doomed Georgia Senate campaign in 2014 for Michelle Nunn, and then found my way up to DC, ended up working on the Hill, and became, over the course of my time with the Democrats and the 2016 election and everything, pretty disaffected with the party and its direction, particularly on foreign policy, which has long been an interest of mine personally. As somebody
Was there anything specifically?
Well, it's funny. I think if you talk to a lot of people at the Quincy Institute, the what radicalized you conversation, I think for a lot of people, particularly in the younger age demographic, it's the Iraq War. I grew up grew up in a like political family, grew up like making phone calls for like Gore and Kerry, like my mom bringing me to phone banks or whatever. So I really believed in the Democratic Party as like this agent of change, but then also watched like the Iraq War unfold and was like pretty upset and then pretty angry to see some of the same proponents of the war then empowered under the Obama administration and Obama's approach to foreign policy being not universally terrible, but in a lot of facets pretty awful and a continuation of the same. So yeah, what radicalized me was like watching the Iraq War and then like just ineffective opposition or no real spine to the anti-war sentiments within the party. And then, yeah, so I left the Hill, went to work in nonprofits, and ended up when opportunity arose at the Quincy Institute, I jumped on it and have been there since I'm coming up, I think maybe 5 years, 4 or 5 years. Yeah. So has been a really good fight. And then just about a year ago, um, had the opportunity to start working with my dear friend Courtney Rawlings, and the rest is
Dr.
history.
Courtney Rawlings. I'm just
Doctor.
kidding.
Well, no, I mean, you're kidding, but also it's true. You are a PhD.
Okay, but I want everyone to know that I was kidding.
So, Courtney, what's your background, and maybe you could talk about what you bring to the table with the Always at War podcast.
Oh my gosh, thanks. I think I have a much different kind of story of how I got into foreign policy, and it still strikes me as strange today. I, studied art and architectural history for like 8 years, getting the PhD, and I, came out of that program in COVID basically, and was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted my future to look like. I mean, for so many years, I was like professor, professor, professor. Well, lo and behold, I think like the years that I was still applying, although maybe I'll still apply in the future, there was like 2, 3 jobs every year. And I was like, I think like I want to, then I had my son and I was like, I think I do want something more flexible and exciting and whatever. And I see this job come up at the Quincy Institute. I'm like, okay, I love the Quincy Institute. Let's get into that. And that's just kind of how it started. They had this opening working on like kind of like a, activating their social media accounts, getting maybe a podcast up, having like more of a digital face. And I was like, well, I have a great face. I love digital. Just kidding. And so that's how I got involved. And since then, I'm actually, revisiting my book project and realizing like how much my past research, which is largely on the development of Los Angeles as an architectural being in the mid-century, touched on the military-industrial complex. And so I'm currently in the midst of kind of fleshing out those arguments, and it's been so exciting because I don't think I realized how engaged I already was in foreign policy, because sometimes you don't even recognize how entrenched we are, even domestically, in the decisions of our government that are purely based on, kind of the military industrial complex or foreign posturing. And so that's been really exciting. And I really hope to kind of develop my future, looking out as an architectural historian, as an art historian, as a cultural critic, vis-a-vis foreign policy.
It's funny, just before I brought you guys on the show, I was actually wrapping up an interview with Andrew Preston, who just did a
Oh
book
yeah.
talk for Quincy about his book Total Defense, which deals with the connection between, FDR New Deal style liberalism and the national security state. And
Yes.
last week I was speaking with Samuel Moyne, who
Yep.
has been writing about Cold War liberalism. And I bring this up because I think something that's interesting is that Quincy, I think, is part of this emerging trend of thinkers, academics, and scholars in recent years, especially after the Iraq War, who are starting to question a lot of pieties we have about international relations and U.S. foreign policy. Can you guys, do you think I'm on point there? I think we see figures from both the left and the right starting to question this more, and even just like more just academics and historians like Samuel Moyne or Andrew Preston, who aren't necessarily like partisans But I feel like everyone is sort of questioning the assumptions now, or there's more people questioning the assumptions than maybe 20,
Hmm.
30 years ago.
Hmm. I mean, I like as a matter of ambiance, that certainly feels true. Like I do think you're right that there is a trend. I guess the question or what your question raises to me is the why. Like
Mm,
why is that occurring? Because I do think it is occurring. You're seeing much more in-depth political histories of, like you said, like how FDR, and the post-World War II efforts to build the national security state that we still live under, both internally within the government and the external factors like the think tanks that help to generate U.S. foreign policy and create the justifications and instruments of U.S. global military primacy. The why of it, like I guess if I were to guess, I'm curious your take, Courtney and JG, if you have one. Like my best guess would be that it's like how we're metabolizing Iraq still, because that
mm,
to me still feels like, this generation's sort of like Vietnam style, like, oh shit, what's happening in front of us and how do we make sense of it? And so maybe it's the lack of any accountability for the people responsible for that, from a political perspective, like nobody paid a price. Maybe having our academics, like, doing this work, it's a way of trying to make sense of what the motivations were and like what, a global crime, like an aggressive invasion of a country, that destabilized and ruined, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives. Um, how do you make sense of that? And how does that fit in with, the continued US rhetoric, up to Biden and Trump about, America as this indispensable nation and the arbiter of global good and democracy and
It's funny,
international law?
not to interrupt you, but it's funny
No.
because now, I'm the same way where I'm like, Iraq was a game changer for
yeah.
me. And I think it was a game changer for a lot of people. And now I
Right.
hear all the, it's become such a point for a lot of people that are skeptical of US foreign policy to bring up Iraq, especially younger folks who lived through that period. I view the whole global war on terror as like a horrific period. Because
Yeah.
I mean,
Correct.
it
I
led
wonder
to
why.
well, it's not just the dead bodies we saw in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay. It's also what was done domestically at home with the Patriot
Mm,
Act.
Hmm. Hmm.
Libertarians have a point when they say, you know, when there's warfare abroad, usually liberties at home get,
almost
trashed
always.
also. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I think
what's
that
interesting is nowadays, the only response I get when I bring up Iraq is, people say to me, "Oh, that's a reductio ad Iraq," and I'm like, "Oh, that's such a way to hand wave." I don't know if you want to comment, Courtney. I'm just like shooting off the hip, but
well, I can't, it's hard for me to relate to that point of view. Like I don't understand fully where it's coming from. I think, one of the one of the reasons I started the podcast is because I genuinely and like earnestly wanted to understand why we kind of got involved in wars like a war with Iraq. Like, and it was earnest. Like, and I still am kind of earnestly want to understand. And I don't think hand waving or kind of go, ah, yeah, Iraq, is like either helpful or meaningful.
right.
Um,
What I'm getting at is like they always say like, "Oh, that was 20 years ago." It's like, but that's not that long
Well,
ago.
that's also just like not true. I think like the war on terror, for instance, of which Iraq was this, a large and mighty and loud piece is just one piece of a world spanning what is it, 75 countries, Alex? 78?
Oh, that we do counterterrorism operations in? Yeah,
Yes.
I think it was between 2021 and 2023. It was something like 78 countries.
70, like that is not a small war, right? Like this spurred us to a war with the globe. That's not to say we're at war with the globe, but sponsoring, funding, enabling, and yeah, sometimes fighting these kind of unending wars. And Iraq is funny for so many reasons. We don't have to get into like why the fuck we're there because I'm sure there's plenty of content about that. But what it brings to mind to me, right, is like, you know, um, that the powers that be learned a valuable lesson, which is actually that we no longer have to explain ourselves when we go to war because, explaining ourselves in Iraq kind of did us dirty. And now everyone's kind of looking at us like, excuse me, why did we go again? And so now they just don't even mention it, right? That brings us to like, the ongoing bombings of Syria, for instance. I don't think that's necessarily in the news. It's not really explained to us. And yet it continues and continues and continues this like onslaught of one of the poorest countries on earth. And that is a direct descendant of the war with Iraq on the wide spanning war on terror. So it's not 20 years ago. It's like going on today.
Yeah, to add to that point, Courtney, like the people who perpetrated the war are very much
Oh my God.
still,
Liz Cheney's.
yeah. Liz Cheney was on the campaign trail with the Vice President Harris. So like no, but like Brett McGurk, you name it, these figures
Yeah.
are still a part of the U.S. foreign policy conversation. Hell, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, like it's easy to say that was 20 years ago, but the reality is the people who made that happen, and we're happy to see it occur, and did not pay any political price for backing this disastrous war that wrecked the country, or, for example, backing a disastrous NATO intervention in Libya that wrecked the country, or
Yeah.
we could list them on and onwards. These people have not paid a political price, and so trying to say, oh, that's an irrelevant example, that's 20 years ago, that's a really choice argument that I don't think holds a lot of weight. And just one more thing, that Courtney, we should talk about this on the show. We're always getting good ideas, but like after the Cold War, and the unipolar moment where America was the unquestioned global power, we intervened more militarily when we didn't have a challenger on the global stage. And so it's not just Iraq, it's about a whole conversation about what America's global superposition encourages us to do. And that is, at least in the case of the post-Cold War era, more than 25% of America's military interventions over the course of its history have occurred in those last 30 years. So why is it that when America isn't challenged on the global stage, it feels capable, and it abrogates or arrogates all of this responsibility on itself to solve everything through a military intervention? It speaks to like a culture of militarism solves everything that's still very much alive in how Washington thinks about the world and how to deal with the problems in the world.
I don't know if you can, if you're open to talking about this at all, Alex, but I know you came from a family that was involved in politics and the Carter administration, but what, what's your view, having grown up around that, on DC? Can you speak to that at all? I hope that's okay to ask.
Yeah, no problem. My dad was worked in the Carter administration, and he hated Washington after they
He
left.
was like one of the whiz kids of the Carter administration,
Yeah,
very
yeah,
young at the time.
he
Yeah.
was. He was my age or younger when he ran Carter's presidential campaign, and went on to be chief of staff in his White House. And I think he left Washington with a really healthy distaste for the culture of DC and the insularity and the self-dealing and everything. I would say that's one of the best lessons he passed on to me. He died when I was pretty young, so like I didn't really have a working political conscience or consciousness that I could like sort of talk to him about, because frankly the Carter administration is like where a lot of like sins that we're living with today are born, like not just the neoliberal turn, but like the Carter doctrine, sort of saying that America's access to the Persian Gulf like must be secured through military force. Obviously, like the response to the revolution and in Iran, and there's a lot to complain about when it comes to the Carter administration. But in terms of how it informed my look at DC, yeah, he just really imbued me with a healthy skepticism of the people in Washington, particularly the Clintons, who he viewed as like my dad really didn't like them, and had like a long standing feud with
What
them.
was the specific reasons for that? I know,
he
juicy
he thought
gossip.
yeah, no, he just thought they were like corrupt self-dealers using politics to enrich themselves, and I kind of think that you could argue
Correct.
that yeah. But I like, for me, it imbued in me a healthy skepticism of people in DC's motives, and that they talk a
Mhm.
big game, but what their actual incentives and motivations are at the end of the day. He helped imbue that in me. But I mean, I think, one thing it also, like, I think is important for political analysis to do a proper one, is that the people or sorry, people you don't know in politics, in this case, I knew somebody in politics, they think they're doing the right thing. Like, I didn't have the chance to ask my dad about the neoliberal turn because I didn't know what that was when I was 15. But like, I know that he thought that like deregulating all these industries was the right thing to do. And he was dead wrong. I think ultimately that administration was dead wrong about a lot of their economic policies. But a lot of people in politics, the people in charge of pulling the levers of the war machine or whatever, are thoroughly convinced in their heart and in their mind that what they're doing is for the best interest of not only America but the world. And so, I think to have a proper analysis, you have to understand the incentives that like get people to a position where they're perpetuating, like, for example, like, if you're Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration enabling and defending Israel's genocide in Gaza,
Mhm.
he's not like going home and like feverishly happy about these people dying. He's thinking of it through this bizarre frame of, this is America has all these responsibilities and Israel is this great ally that is like the bastion of democracy in the Middle East. And all these things that they say, they really do kind of believe, and it fits into their worldview that allows them, gives them the moral certitude and confidence to like help perpetuate a world historic crime, and then turn around and talk about uh liberal values that are being upheld in like a genocidal war. So that was another thing of being close to the political system, realizing that people who are doing things that are bad and hurtful still believe that what they're doing is for the right thing, which is important, I think, for people to understand the analysis of how politicians work and how people in the policymaking sphere work.
It goes back to what another colleague of yours, Kelly Vlahos, always says to me. When we talk about her time that she spends in DC, she says, I'm in the belly of the beast.
Oh, I love
Very
Kelly.
much, very much.
But
She's
there is
great.
something about the sort of Beltway culture. It just feels so insulated from the concerns that everyone else
Yeah.
has. And maybe you can speak to that, Courtney, and your thoughts on just the culture of the blob, and how much of a threat it poses really to, I would say, like, just basic democratic values in this country. That's the weird thing. Our technocrats claim to support democracy, but they really hate it when the plebs criticize them.
I have so many things that I want to say at one time. Like my mouth is like not working all of a sudden. I'm like, oh my God, what do I say? There's so many horrible, I would say, incentives that incentivize this kind of culture of exclusion that go back, well before the Cold War, but really are crystallized during that period. One of the things Alex and I have been talking about a lot, just kind of offline, is how the trust in kind of not necessarily expertise in that they like were educated in this, but expertise in that like they went to Yale and have been in politics for a long time, allows so many people within the Beltway and in Beltway culture to believe that they can make decisions. Their understanding of foreign policy, for instance, far exceeds the normal everyday person, and that it's actually necessary to exclude the populace in foreign policy decisions because it's so vastly different than domestic decision making, which is just like simply not true.
Well, I was going to say national security needs to be separate from all the other functions of democracy. That's like the prevailing view for many in the Beltway.
Yeah, I think it's like it's also, but it serves to protect their. So one thing that I was struggling with when I had my little mouth problem a second ago is like when Alex mentioned incentives, it brings like kind of to the fore my major interest in foreign policy, which is intention and how we kind of can make sense of the blob in general and how regular people should conceptualize their actions. Because it's very true that so many people within the Beltway, although sometimes I do believe they go home and put their fingers together and go, ha ha ha, like evil strikes
some
again.
of them do. Some of them do, definitely.
But for the most part, I think Alex is right that, these are actions happening in good faith or in faith. Okay. And how is that possible? Because those same actors are wreaking havoc, taking lives, funding genocides. They are taking away every single day more and more protections of the American people in order to do things like fund genocides. And it's mind-boggling. And they're also the same ones that turn around and tell you to your face that you don't possibly understand. There's all these secret machinations happening in the background that your feeble, non-beltway mind couldn't possibly fathom. And I'm so sick of hearing that absolute dribble come out of the mouths of people who don't even understand their own rationale for doing things, which in my mind tends to, not all the time, but oftentimes comes back to financial incentives. And I'm not saying that people are doing things specifically for money. It's not that simple. They're right about that. But incentives aren't that simple. Intention isn't that simple. Sometimes we act in good faith, thinking we're doing the right thing, but oh right, I forgot. I'm also getting paid to do that. Or also, my friend's going to make a lot of money that way. Or also, like, we can build up, for the Pentagon budget, if it increases, then this will increase and my job safety is better, then I can do this afterwards. All of these things are happening in one's mind, not necessarily consciously. That's what we misunderstand about intention, right? But they are the background informers of our actions. And I think we should call people out more for that, because whether or not it's conscious, it's happening and it is influencing you. And we need to bring more and more attention to the disgusting, what is it called? Incestuous relationship so many of our politicians have with money.
Well, that's probably a good segue into the.
I feel like I just went on the longest tirade of my life.
I was loving.
I enjoyed it. What?
But yeah, I'm
Seriously
pissed
though,
off.
it's a good segue into the. I'm just waking up to the news today of Senate rejects bid to halt sale of bombs and rifles to Israel. I think what you just said is a good segue. Politicians are in bed with the war state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the more disgusting things I've had to witness in my time at the Quincy Institute, we've watched people vote down. Sorry, Alex, I'll stop tirading in 1 second. But we've watched our Senate and Congress or whatever kind of forward weapons to Israel, knowing full well what Israel's doing on the ground over and over and over again. And for a while, US, at least some of them, were like, okay, well, Israel's war is just. Well, guess what? The American people do not believe that anymore. Support for Israel's war has fallen to like an all-time low at 32%. Okay, so Americans don't want to give 675, or I saw 675 and 657. So someone got the numbers crossed. But that, over $650 million worth of bombs to Israel. We don't want to do that. And yet yesterday we saw senator after senator walk up and submit a vote supporting a ginormous arms sale to Israel.
Yeah, I think that you're right to say that that's like one of the hardest things to keep watching over and over again. And I think particularly I think there are two ways to look at this most recent vote. And I think both of them are right in some ways, and you have to find how to combine them. The one hand, how cynical is it that all these Democrats have spoken up about hunger in Gaza and then still turn around and say, well, but Israel needs more rifles and Israel needs more bombs. Also cynical to like see some people skip it, like future presidential aspirants like Ruben Gallego or Alyssa Slotkin. Skip the vote. They have better things to do than think about,
Yeah, Alyssa
She,
Slotkin, for instance, had to go on late night television. Wait, what show? On
Colbert, late
Colbert,
night.
which is
Yeah.
getting canceled. But she was like, you know what? This is more important. And she had the audacity, by the way, to go on Colbert and talk about the war in Gaza and how
Yes.
awful it was and how it's hurting Israel and how, the U.S. should do something about it. Excuse me, you're
Yeah.
skipping the vote.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
I'm screaming.
Somebody, no, it's like, hey, somebody else should do something. Like, not me. I'm just a U.S. senator with like one of 100 votes
Oh
that
my
could
God.
yeah, it's very frustrating. So like, I think that all of that is true. And, you saw last night the most Democrats, you saw 27, I think was the vote. 27 Democrats voted to suspend offensive. And again, we should talk about the offensive versus defensive distinction, which is pretty bunk. But we saw 27 Democrats vote against sending bombs and rifles to Israel, which I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago would feel unimaginable, right? So, and I think we want to call that out because it's something that our colleagues are working on both at Quincy and without to sort of build this base of opposition to continuing to fund the genocide. But the progress is not coming fast enough. And Democrats, like, I watched some of the speeches beforehand. Senator Dick Durbin was like, this vote, I'm voting to block these sales. It's painful as somebody who's dedicated their career to standing with Israel to like do this. And I still think there's like a fundamental disconnect between sort of the reality of this genocide and like how it came to pass as a result of like unconditional US support for Israel and the occupation, and like that could be just totally separate from the mission of quote unquote standing with Israel no matter what. So there are all these contradictions at play. So you both have to be like, yay, progress. Like I'm glad some Democrats are getting it, and it's like a good sign that presidential aspirants like Gallego or Slotkin are like running scared. They don't want to go
Well,
on
they're
the
reading
record
the
on
tea
this.
leaves,
Yeah,
like
they
they
are.
know we've
Yeah.
changed our mind as a people.
Right,
Uh,
right. But then
yeah.
also not enough progress, not
I
quickly
mean,
enough.
it's
Yeah,
too late.
it's too late. Yeah,
Gaza has been razed.
yeah,
Gaza has been destroyed. If we got
yeah,
food to Gaza and tomorrow, countless children would starve,
yeah. Still,
even with food in their mouths.
yeah,
So that's not to applaud people who have changed their tune. I welcome dialogue working. That's what it's supposed to do. But I think
yeah.
we still have to hold these people accountable for
100%,
having held their tongue for so long when the moral
100%.
clarity was right in front of their face.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that because I saw that the I'm not bashing anyone or anything, and it's
Come
like,
on, let's
okay,
bash. Let's
it's
bash.
good if it's good if they came to like see this as an issue. But I'm reading an article from uh it's on AOL, but it's from Fox News. Pod Save America Obama bros want to see
Right,
Democrats totally cut off aid
right,
to Israel.
right.
And I actually watched the video where they were talking about that. I'm like, wow, the Pod Save America guys are like saying we should cut off military
Mm-hmm,
support for
mm-hmm,
Israel.
mm-hmm.
Has there been like what is do you think that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation scandal
Oh my
and
God.
just the starvation happening now has changed something? Because I would not have expected the guys from Pod Save America to be
Right,
saying this kind of thing
right.
even a year ago. I hope you don't think I'm off base.
No, 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 no. I'm very curious to hear both you guys' suppositions on this because we did like a Twitter Spaces last night after the vote. A couple Quincy people did to just talk about this, and this was a question like, why is it that seeing children starve, like, it brought about this different sort of like surge and opposition, either rhetorically or actually? Like you saw, like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama both put out statements in the last week about, the starvation. But I think the Pod Save thing is probably a more significant signal, just in terms of them being like young Democrats with like with hopes to drive the party for like decades to come. That is a real significant shift again. But like, why is it that seeing kids starve and not seeing kids blown up? Like, what is the fundamental difference? Is it just like aesthetic? Like, I think the most convincing argument I saw, I think it was Matthew I don't remember whose tweet I was reading, but so it struck me as true that there's something you can't like really obfuscate, like all the obfuscating arguments are like rendered invalid. Like, when a kid gets a bomb dropped on their tent, there's not a good argument for that, but people
Yeah.
still create rhetorical obstacles to like, well, this was targeting gone wrong, blah, blah, blah. I'm not
Right.
saying that is legit, but they at least have things that they can say.
Hamas could have been nearby, right?
Right, right. Again, not saying
Yeah.
that those things are legit, but there are arguments
No,
they can
they're
employ that give,
nonsense.
yeah, but that give them distance from the
Yeah.
truth. Whereas, like, it is really hard. Some people are still trying, but it is really hard to make the argument that like that kid had to starve for
Yeah.
Israel's security or something. I don't know, Courtney. What do you think? Like, what
No,
accounts
I
for?
think that's exactly right. Honestly, I think you're correct. It's unfortunate because these same people, Hillary Clinton, let's just use her as an example, they knew that kicking the UN out of Israel was going to starve. I mean, sorry, kicking the UN out of Gaza was going to starve Gazans. That was the plan. Let's not like pretend that it wasn't. That was the plan. They had been Israel had even before kicking the UN had been withholding aid from the Strip for a very long time. The U.S. had I would say, comical, spit in the face, fake propaganda campaign of building that fucking floating dock or whatever, where we were supposed to bring in aid that broke every 5 seconds, never did anything. So now I'm getting off base. Okay, I'm focusing. I'm so angry today.
It's worth getting angry about.
But I unfortunately think you're right. So it's true. I think the difference is that the politicians haven't changed their minds because they're seeing starving Gazans because they knew that Gaza was going to starve. But if you talk about the general population suddenly seeing people starving, I do think it is this difference of intent, right? Not to like sound like Elizabeth Anscombe today, but you know, when you drop a bomb, I think like a normal everyday person goes, sure, there's like splatter, like it's not like going to be as direct and especially with this kind of dispersed Hamas, right? Which is like what they continue telling us that Hamas is in the tent cities, Hamas is in the hospitals. Okay, sure. That's, then you have, children die as a result of that. Whereas this is a different animal because Israel has tried to tell us actually we're starving Hamas when that's not like, then you see the starvation of everyone, right? And you can't use this explanation of like, oh, it's, we're targeting Hamas and women and children just happen to die. They're starving the entire population. And you cannot, there is so few rhetorical devices that can make sense of that. Not to say that people aren't trying. Just today, the Wall Street Journal put out an article on the lie of starvation and how it's all this photograph campaign is actually, showing these starving children is actually a mind fuck, and we can't believe what we see because maybe they all have cerebral palsy. No, they don't all have. Not all children in Gaza have cerebral palsy, and I don't even
And
know
if
what
they
to say
did,
to
that
that.
wouldn't, and if they did, it still would not justify their starvation.
Okay,
Right?
first of
Yeah.
all, yes, but they're trying to say, my understanding of the Wall Street Journal
Yeah.
article is
Yeah.
like, oh, these are exaggerated
Right.
images
Right.
because this one kid also has cerebral palsy. He might also be starving, which he doesn't mention, but also has
Right.
cerebral palsy.
I wonder, I just thought of this, but it's got like, we have these moments in time that we think of as affecting the US opinion on previous wars, like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, or like maybe, hypothetically, the collateral damage video, like vis-a-vis Iraq and the war on terror or Guantanamo. But also, like, I think I name these moments, and then those things still didn't end the war, even if we think of them as altering the cultural conscience. And
That's I think the horror of what's happening in Gaza is,
right,
no matter how much you say, no matter how much you do, I mean, we've literally had people, self-immolate in protests of Gaza.
right,
And I'm not, that's like
right,
horrific to me, but the greatest horror is no matter what anyone does, no
right.
matter how much people protest, it just goes on.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
I
I
think
know.
I think it brings us back to our original point, which is that foreign policy is not democratic because
Right,
I think the
right.
people, the people like you and me, a majority, I can't stress this enough, a majority of Americans think we should stop being Israel, right? That being our leverage to end the war. Because no, Israel cannot fight this war without our millions and billions in weapons. Um, but the votes last night being just the most recent example do not reflect the will of the people.
Right.
And that is why we have this crazy making feeling. I'm at home looking at children, pictures of dead children every day. Every fucking day, I have to see a picture of a dead child and feel absolutely useless and helpless and hopeless because I know that the policymakers in Washington aren't listening to me and everyone who feels the way I do, which is nearly everyone at this point.
And to put a fine point on it, yeah, this is something we talk about on the podcast a lot. And I think that we should like basically repeat it every episode that like this anti-democratic reality of foreign policy is by design. That after World War II, we built this national security state housed largely under the executive branch that would give the president extraordinary power to direct U.S. foreign policy at his will and his or her will. But like that is effectively insulated foreign policy making from democratic inputs, and um, it continues to be this way. And I mean, even more so, like the ending of the draft after Vietnam, like Washington has gone to great lengths to reduce the political costs, the day-to-day costs felt by Americans that can be connected to our endless interventions. And that's been a very successful project, and I think people feel the futility, see how what a bad state of affairs that is when they feel the futility of like this is the worst thing I can imagine, like all of these people being strategically killed with our tax dollars, like lured into killing fields and then shot in front of a US backed charity, like all of these things that are just horrific to comprehend, and it makes you feel truly insane to try and like think about it and how this can be justified, and that this is all the result again of a successful project to insulate foreign policy making from democratic inputs. And I mean, I think that maybe we haven't really talked about this, but I wonder if part of the reason that this reality, besides obviously like witnessing a live stream genocide, part of the reason that this reality feels so frustrating is Americans, particularly post 2008, like already felt this like slipping away of control over like what the government does, like post Citizens United, post whatever. Like we just are less and less capable of seemingly shaping our political reality via democracy, which in 21st century America just means going to the polls every 2 or 4 years. You know, no other forms of democratic control are really thought of when we talk about democracy. So like maybe part of it is that people are already primed to feel like incredibly disempowered from our political system, and then seeing like the worst thing imaginable, like we're paying to kill a bunch of kids, like that's what's happening. My tax dollars that we are going to help ensure that Israel could kill a bunch of kids in Gaza. Maybe that's just like it's the last straw, or the straw that breaks the camel's back. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's even after, people like Trump campaigned on ending wars.
Right.
I'm going to end the war in Ukraine on day one.
Right.
On week
Right.
one, he bartered, got his way to a ceasefire, however briefly held, right? And then he turns around, that's what got him in office. Finally, votes mean something. Yay, we're going to have an anti-war president. No, turns around and now is like back bog standard fighting both of these wars.
And a little war
question.
in Iran too. Why not?
Why not?
I wanted to add to that because I don't know what you guys think of this, but I was always skeptical of the idea of Trump as this anti-war figure, even before the second term and his second campaign run, because I felt like Trump, maybe he doesn't want the U.S. to be engaged in this or that war in the Middle East, but I know a lot of like Trump people that are very hawkish on like Mexico. I've met Trump people that want to go to like war with Mexico. And then there's all the talk about Greenland and Canada. I feel like most of our politics in this country is just competing factions of expansionism or adventurism, I guess is what I'm getting at. whether it's Trump on one end or Democrats on the other embracing Liz Cheney.
Right. Well, have you? I don't know if you've had the pleasure of talking to Greg Grandin on the show anyway recently, but I think he would say that that is like, the release valve for what used to be an expansionist mindset when it came to frontierism, like war all over the world is like the release valve that both Democrats and Republicans can get to about like using our power to expand our influence and our wealth. Um, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Courtney. I'll just very briefly, like, I think the calculus, like, I don't know many people who were really like would have put a lot of money on Trump governing differently in the second term than the first term. And I think any most or all anti-interventionists I know were like pretty chastened by what his first term meant, which was not a reduction in war. He fueled the war, the Saudi and UAE coalition war in Yemen. He bombed Qasem Soleimani and brought us to the brink of war with Iran. He left the JCPOA, like all these things that were destructive and like not helpful to bringing Americans like home, to like closing military bases, to like less intervention, less coercion on the world stage. So I don't know a lot of people who were like, second time, it's definitely going to be a different. But I do think I know plenty of people in the anti-interventionist camp that I would argue correctly made the strategic choice to say, what if Trump governed differently this time? Because for the exact reasons we talked about, the executive has incredible control over U.S. foreign policy. And if somebody finds themselves in the presidency who genuinely wants to unwind our global military, our posture of global military
Yeah,
primacy.
but real
Sorry,
quick, I guess my point is, let's say Trump truly wanted us to get out of the Middle East,
Sure.
but still he's going to have bad policies on Cuba
Sure.
or Venezuela, or that's what I'm saying. Like it seems like on one end we have people that just want to invade and do war in the Middle East, and then on the other end you have people saying, well, no, we have to focus on getting hawkish with China. And then on the other end, it's like, no, let's focus on Latin America. It's just war, 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 war.
Yes, no, that is a fair point, that like the choice is between like which kind of wars you like. But I do think hypothetically, like Trump in those first 2 weeks in office, he said something about like cutting the military budget in half and like doing a trilateral with China and Russia to get rid of everybody's nukes. Again, I'm not saying that I know anybody who believed he was going to do that, but like a president in the White House, as like, unpredictable as Trump is, he could unilaterally change the status quo of US interventionism.
Yeah.
And so I think it is always like an okay strategic bet to be like, sure, let's see it, sir. Go for it. But I partly responding to, there's like this criticism that is constantly leveled at anti-interventionists on the left, that is like, you guys are fools. Like, you guys were betting everything on Trump being anti-war. And like, I don't know anybody who was actually like betting on expecting this to happen. I think that the strategic ploy is always, it would be great if it happened. I dare you to make it happen. If you believe all the
Yeah.
things you're saying, you should go forward with reducing America's military.
I mean, the left does the same thing, or liberals. I dare not call them the left. Liberals do the same thing with domestic policies. They never, first of all, they never promise to end wars, right?
Right.
They're always like actually promising to make us more lethal and deadly, or whatever. Okay. But they do the same thing with domestic policies, right? They like tell us this story. We vote them in thinking, oh, we're going to get our, let's say college loans forgiven. No, it never happens, right? And yet they cry wolf at populism when it came to Trump. And I think that kind of showed their asses. They're like, oh, we can't trust the actual people, because Trump, for all of his flaws, he loves the performance and he wants to be liked. Okay. And so he will kind of instantiate and regurgitate the desires of people. And it was heartening to see a president actually say, like, yeah, maybe we should cut back on nukes. Maybe we should stop like intervening in the Middle East. Maybe, we should put America first, which of course you can demonize in a million different ways. But the liberal response being, uh-oh, he's saying what people want. And it's and that's bad. And of course he never acted on it. No president ever fucking acts on what people actually want, but he said it. And that is the danger of populism, right? Is saying the desires of people, because what if they're dangerous? And that's why the liberals and the conservatives will turn around and tell you you don't belong in foreign policy, is because Americans belonging in foreign policy doesn't look like endless intervention. It may look like whatever. I don't know these people saying we should go to war with Mexico. I've heard tale of such a thing. It's kind of ridiculous, but whatever. In general, the American people, at least lately, tend to be anti-war, and are sick of these endless interventions.
But by the way, real quick, I was going to say, I mean, I do know a lot of Trump supporters as well that are like legitimately they don't like interventionism. So I
Yeah.
hope I wasn't giving the impression that
Oh no,
like, yeah.
no, you didn't give that impression at all. I just think it was interesting. It's like all my kind of yelling into the void comes back to like hating liberals, and that's my own problem. I think it's kind of galvanizing a lot of the country. Because they do things like, like we have an opportunity to replace Biden with Kamala, and she turns around and she didn't have to really do much, but she does go, let's make America's military more lethal. Let's threaten Iran. I'm like, come on. No one wants to hear that. We're fucking sick of it. We are sick of always being at war. Well, that's a plug for my own podcast. And for whatever reason, and that's kind of what the podcast is about, right? That desire of the American people is continuously silenced. And we are continuously told to mind our own business, to go back to caring about, I don't know, potholes or homelessness, all these things, which, by the way, we should totally care about. But we don't belong in foreign policy because that's just above our pay grade.
Yeah. There was this clip we discussed in our most recent podcast with Daniel Bessner about somebody at a Politico event asked, I think it was Gene Sheen, about Ro Khanna's, like, Ro Khanna made this argument, that congressman from California, that Democrats should be the anti-war party. And the response was, well, it's just not that simple. Like, foreign policy isn't just a question of are interventions good or bad. America's interests are very complicated. And this is, again, just one of those devices that is meant to baffle popular involvement or interest in foreign policy. Foreign policy is complicated. It's for the experts. It's over there. You don't need to worry about it. We're taking care of it over here. And that's like, that argument doesn't hold water, because clearly they're not taking care of it. If you look at the state of the world, is the U.S., the U.S. is selling arms to one or more sides in like 2/3 of the world's wars. Like, is that helping? Is that creating peace?
Yeah,
like,
we're increasing terrorism in Africa by 100,000% or whatever it was.
Right. Yeah, that's
thanks
like
a lot.
That's one of the most insane statistics. Like, the amount of deaths from terrorism before the U.S. war on terror in Africa, and then after, like, the many decades of intervention, it's increased 100,000%.
Yeah,
which is crazy.
Bravo, you guys are doing great without everyday people's input. I didn't even know we were doing that until I joined the Quincy Institute. I was like, we're fighting counterterrorism in all over Africa. What? Okay. Thanks for
The
letting me
Africa
know.
stuff is like really undercovered in a lot
It's
of ways.
sick.
Yes.
Aren't we like bombarded? Now I can't remember off the top of my head. We're
bombing
bombarding.
Somalia right now.
Just demolishing a country.
There's like
it's got no coverage.
Resurgence of Al-Shabaab, I guess. It's, like you said, JG, it doesn't raise to the, doesn't like get on the radar of Americans, even though if you're on the other side of those bombs, like, that's the most important thing happening in your life.
I guess there were just two more things I wanted to cover, and maybe I was alluding to this earlier, but one of the things I worry about now with, I guess the sort of second Trump administration, and even more broadly, what people call the America First movement, is a lot of people will throw out this slur of isolationism. I don't actually think these people are isolationists, a lot of them. I think a lot of them think like, well, we need to start focusing on our own backyard and our sphere of influence. And I think that could lead to more interventionism in places like Latin America. Do you guys think I'm all like off base and being concerned about that? I'm not saying that's what will happen, but I'm also not sold that these people truly want to like stop intervening.
Right. I well, so like there's the categorization of you've got like the interventionists, and this is just the popular categorization. I'm not gonna can't say that it's absolutely true. You have interventionists, which I would say is the grand majority of US politicians and policymakers. You have like restrainers, which is what Quincy Institute is full of, people who genuinely want to restrain the use of US military force and coercive economic measures to like, bring about a better, more stable like world and more peaceful. And then you have prioritizers who are people who want to like restrain in some theaters so that the US can focus on China or can focus in its backyard. Um, I think there's like a friendly accord maybe between prioritizers and restrainers would be a way to talk about it, because I do think generally less intervention in one theater or another is like a good thing for global peace, global stability, and prosperity. But I think you get a sort of a broader tension down the road if America does retrench towards what? And I think the restraint answer is towards like a more just, equitable global order where it's not just where what Washington says
This
goes.
gets at some of the divides that exist between. I mean, I in a way, it's like I know Quincy sort of says it's realism and restraint, but that sometimes there's even tension between those two camps.
Sure. Sure.
Like
Well,
yeah, I like a lot of John Mearsheimer's work, but I
mhm.
find him very hawkish on like China.
He is
Yeah.
yeah. He's in a different place than a lot of Quincy experts on sort of ultimately what the posture should be vis-a-vis East Asia. But I think this is what makes Quincy really, I mean, this is such a shameless plug, but I believe it. It's like what makes Quincy really interesting is that there are these like
Yeah.
legit debates and divides, and actually like having these conversations out loud about like what the posture should be, what it means for Americans, what it means for people around the world. It's just not like based on all of the good versus evil. Are you an appeaser, or like we're actually getting into these debates about what the world should
It's
look
not
like.
just everything goes back to Munich.
Yeah, and it would be great. Like I feel confident America would end up with a better foreign policy if we could at least talk about like the actual realities of our foreign policy, the actual consequences and costs, just about like uh in a realistic way. But this is me pining for what, like a 1955 style debate that then drives U.S. foreign policy. Like I'm
Yeah.
also not convinced that that's always how like our policy making works, but I do think it's something to strive for. And the Quincy has been like an important counterweight to intervention, which is like the dominant conversation in the U.S. And being able to produce research and reaction to news and scholarship and reporting on what it might look like to have America do something besides militarily intervene everywhere all the time is has been exciting to be a part of. I don't know, Courtney, what did I miss there?
Well, I was going to bring it back to the isolationists. I think some people, unfortunately, misunderstand or conflate restraint with isolation. Isolationism is, completely inward facing and kind of shutting yourself off from the world, which is, of course, not what we, intend to do. We intend, like, I think Quincy advocates for stopping the wanton murder of civilians needlessly across the globe in the name of democracy, because that's not what we're doing, and it's useless and it's cruel. But that is not to be mistaken for isolationism. No, I don't think we should be bombing Somalia. No, I don't think we should be bombing Yemen, Syria. I don't think we should be bombing Israel. Obviously, I don't speak for the Quincy Institute, but I think they'd be pretty confident. They'd back me up on that. Um, and uh, and that is not isolationism. That
Oh,
is
also, let's be
restraint.
honest. It, isolationism is such a snarl word, and it's just such a fucking nebulous term. That's why I was so happy when Stephen Wertheim wrote that book. What was it called? The
Is it
Tomorrow of the World?
Tomorrow. Oh, good job.
Yeah,
Yeah. Uh, I thought book was awesome. I would highly recommend
yeah.
to anybody.
He's a great writer.
He is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's just the only thing that I could think of that like gets hurled at Quincy sometimes, and I'm like, what do you? You could just
Well,
Google that. I hate
well,
saying
yeah.
it, so I never do because, I know
Just
how to
Google
use
it.
Twitter and you're not allowed to say that anymore. But like sometimes I do want to say like,
Just
whoa,
Google it. Yeah,
hold
well,
on
I
there.
I mean like also like a thing that Quincy talks about a lot is like America has significant diplomatic muscle, less
Yeah.
so when the State Department and other soft power tools get cut and like diplomatic engagement gets cut. But like talking is good. Like that is something that got us a lot of heat vis-a-vis the Ukraine war is that like we were proponents of early diplomacy to see if we
Yeah.
could stop Russia's invasion. Instead, the Biden administration embraced a policy of wanting to quote see Russia weakened. And it's hard to say definitively, this many
It's
years later.
not to interrupt you, but I've recently had a very pro-Ukrainian journalist on,
Sure.
Tom Much, and he was saying it was funny because I was talking to him about it, and he was saying, one of the things is that Biden didn't really want to, have a strategy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We should
I
have
think
we
that's
should have.
clear.
Well, he was saying we should have given weapons while also pushing the Russians to negotiate. And it's like,
Uh-huh.
is that really that much different from the Quincy line?
No, it's not really. I mean, Quincy had an official, we issued an official position because we were getting attacked so much for like what, or we issued an official position of the Ukraine war to make sure that people understood what we were arguing for, and that was that there should be a strategy to pair U.S. military aid to Ukraine with some sort of diplomatic track to bring it into the war because military aid to Ukraine is one of the levers we would have at the negotiating table with Russia. And instead, what Biden, I mean, I would agree with the guest you mentioned that Biden didn't have a particular strategy to some extent, but he did say, I mean, Austin, his defense secretary said, we want to see Russia weaken to the extent that it can't do things like the invasion of
Well,
Ukraine.
no,
And I think,
that's what we were talking about. It's
yeah,
like there was sort of a let's let Russia bleed mentality. And I mean, that's what's offensive to me about Biden is I don't think there was a strategy. And I think, I mean, if we were going to talk about values, the value we should have been fighting for was allowing Ukraine or aiding Ukraine in defending their territorial sovereignty.
Yeah.
That should have been the issue, but it was more like, no, we don't care about that. It's
well,
about weakening
yeah.
Russia.
I mean, I think if Ukraine's sovereignty was your North Star defending Ukraine's sovereignty, which I think is a good approach because Ukraine was the victim of aggressive war, like one of the highest crimes when it comes to international law. Then that meant like not wanting to see a long dragged out war in which Russia would in slow motion wreck Ukraine and create not only kill a lot of civilians and many, many more military, young people who were drafted and dragged into the military, but um, you know, not see the country's politics and society and infrastructure ruined, which it's happened in a slow motion scale. And we don't know for sure whether or not, you know, putting Ukraine's NATO membership on the table in negotiations with Russia in 2022 could have stopped or even prevented the war because,
Mhm.
Biden administration explicitly said we didn't discuss Ukraine's NATO aspirations with Russia before the invasion. Like we refused to on principle. We can't know if that would have worked because Biden never tried it. And like if this war is this historically bad crime that has caused a lot of suffering in Ukraine, which it absolutely has, then I think there's absolutely a conversation to be had about why didn't they try everything both before the war started and afterwards, including talking, which is
Yeah.
a very low cost effort.
Free.
Yeah, it's free. In fact, you don't have to buy a bunch of bombs. You just need to get the plane over to the embassy where you're meeting the
Yeah.
person to talk and feel out the other side. But like Biden's team showed a total reluctance out of like the idea that talking was a gift to Russia. And like that's not how like tough-minded diplomacy should always be on the table.
Go
Like
off,
talking with our
Alex.
adversaries. Yeah, sorry. I
No, no, no. I'm in mad support. I was just going to add that, like, that's, I think, the realist side, right? Realistically, Russia is hugely powerful and they're right next to Ukraine, right? And that we have to acknowledge that, not this, like, kind of quasi-moral argument that Biden had, which is like, on principle, we're not going to talk to Russia. That has not been an American principle for a very long time. And the quote unquote realistic, okay, to be crass with the language, response would have been like, okay, Russia has invaded. If we go forward, we're going to sacrifice Ukraine. That's also a realistic stance. We basically did sacrifice Ukraine and Ukrainian lives just because of our reticence of negotiating with our quote unquote enemy. We could have saved countless hundreds of thousands of lives had we had the actual moral clarity to get to the table with Russia, something that we've done, by the way, dozens of times in the past. So it's not some sort of anti-Americanism to negotiate with Russia. It would have been a life-saving measure.
Not to play devil's advocate, but sometimes I do get frustrated with the Ukraine debates, and I'm not saying you guys are doing this, but I think there does need to be an acknowledgement of there's certain interests that Ukraine has as well. I can understand. I mean, I don't think they're going to get back Crimea. Even Ukrainians I know will say that's not happening. But I think you have to be tough on. There's going to have to be tough-handed diplomacy,
Sure.
and Ukraine can't expect to just give in to every maximalist demand of Russia either.
No, but I think totally hear what you're saying. I think the reality is that Ukraine, Zelensky or a future leader, whoever what came next, was always going to have a tough sell in the country about whatever was negotiated when it comes to the what is going to be required to end the war. And Ukrainians absolutely have a say. It's their country. They're going to be at the diplomatic table. However, the overarching this is where people are like, oh, the debate about NATO is totally irrelevant and academic BS. We can feel that way, but that's certainly not how Russia feels. For a long time, they have talked about NATO as their primary, Ukrainian membership in NATO as a red line and something that they could not abide by. And we have always refused to discuss that question. And it's not a question that Ukraine itself can solve. We also have to be at the table to address this security concern. I'm not saying that it's legitimate or that it justifies an invasion, not at all, but it is seemingly sincerely held by the Russian government. And so the US was going to have to play a role at the diplomatic table. And one of those things, the role that the US could have played, that Zelensky could have needed maybe in 2022 to bring an end to the war, would be playing the heavy, saying, hey, this really sucks, but the US is making me negotiate an end to this war. That he was going to have opposition within his government, particularly from the right, to any peace settlement with Ukraine. But the US could have been the person that he pointed to. Biden could have been the person he pointed to say, I know this isn't perfect. I know we don't want to, have to give up territory or make an agreement to not join NATO, but it's the best choice we have to avoid seeing our country wrecked. That's not what the US position ended up being. And the US didn't use its leverage over either Russia or Ukraine to try and find and identify those mutual compromise terms that would have been pleasant or unpleasant for Ukraine, certainly for its leaders, for its people, for the people who suffered under the Russian invasion, of course. But ends to wars are often quite messy, and the hope is reducing the most amount of suffering and damage. And I mean, just for the same reason that if you're looking at Gaza, I am certain that a ceasefire deal in 2023 would have been really unfair to Palestinians, and it may not have secured statehood, but there was still an opportunity to prevent mass suffering and death. And so, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, do you think a settlement will have to end with? I feel like neither side can go home completely happy.
Sure. I mean, I think that's kind of the story of negotiations, is that, yeah, generally not everybody walks away pleased. But again, it's sort of I mean, not to this is an imperfect term, but harm reduction is an impact, is a goal of diplomacy. Again, imagining if Ukraine had not spent the last 3 years seeing its civilians killed, its infrastructure degraded, its young people both fleeing the country or being sent to die in this like grinding war.
Not to interrupt you, but it arguably puts Ukraine in a weaker negotiating position.
Well, I think that certainly, I mean, look, the Quincy Institute was very supportive of this effort in late 2022 of these Democrats in the House who came out and implored Biden to use all of his diplomatic leverage to try and bring an end to the war. And I think if you can imagine, if the U.S. had really invested at that moment, which was after Ukraine's successful counteroffensive, where they had the biggest gain of territory they've seen over the course of the war. If the U.S. had really invested at that high point of leverage, when General Mark Milley in Biden administration himself said, "Hey, maybe we should think about diplomacy," you could imagine, again, so like not the dream terms for Ukraine, but a way to end the suffering and prevent future suffering. Some sort of deal that could have secured Ukraine's sovereignty, ended the war, come to some sort of broader understanding about what the European security architecture might be after the end of this invasion, that was at least feasible. And now, 3 years later, like Biden, by lack of effort, left it to the next president to solve. And if you don't like how, like, I mean, Trump has not succeeded in bringing the sides closer to the table. And we've seen these horrible Russian attacks on Ukraine that are getting worse, and we're seeing Russia make progress on the battlefield and now threaten like new strategic locations in what is currently Ukrainian held territory. And so Ukraine's leverage is worse. It's lost a lot more civilians. It's lost young people from both fleeing the war and dying in the war. The prospects are tough, are really bad. And
Yeah.
these are the things that proponents of early diplomacy pointed out were the excellent possibilities of a grinding war in pursuit of total victory or in pursuit of seeing Russia weakened. Um, and,
I would
and so,
just I
yeah,
would
go
just
ahead.
add really quick, Alex, that I think this is just another example of kind of an anti-populist sentiment fueling this war, insofar as, like, I think it was over a year ago now, a Gallup poll found that over half of Ukrainians wanted an end to this war. I can only imagine that that's increased as they've lost hundreds of thousands of people. The people who haven't died have left the country, and it's going to cost trillions to rebuild. And now I don't know where this stands, but remember, we're going to take all their minerals or something. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know. It's just like cruel and unusual what we've done to Ukraine, which was, basically march them to their death. When the people themselves, I think, early on, of course, wanted to fight this war, realized, we're, no matter how many U.S. weapons we have, we're dying at an insane rate, and we need to come to a negotiated end. And so, just another example of how, powers that be continue wars that people don't want to fight, and they're the ones that pay the price.
Before we close out, because I know I kept you longer than expected, one of the things I know Quincy has been talking about, and I don't know if you guys have covered it on the podcast, is this idea that we're moving towards a more multipolar world. Uh, I know some people will say, no, that's bullshit. We're still in the unipolar moment. We still have the American empire. Where do you guys stand on that?
Damn, that's a fucking deep one. I mean, that's one of the main reasons I joined Quincy. I think when they asked me, like, what are you doing here? You're an art historian. I was like, actually, like, I think I might be an architectural historian of the war. Anyways, and I was so curious about this question of a multipolar world. I think um, this. Okay, how do I say this? I think at this time, this is just Courtney talking, by the way, not Quincy Institute. So I'll have, because I think we have competing kind of ideas, but you know, the United States is still the empire. We are still running the show, very much so. But there is an opportunity, like there is a growing counterweight to United States hegemony. I think the BRICS nations show that. I think China shows that, and we should not. There is no need to protect our ongoing hegemony. The Monroe Doctrine was a mistake, and that was only talking about Central and South America. Now we should not have a doctrine that is globe spanning, and that is where I think some of some of these kind of accusations of isolationism come in too. It's like, well, you don't want America to be the hegemon. It's like, not really, not me personally, and I don't think it's worthwhile for Americans in particular. I saw Anna Kachayan saying this recently on Tucker Carlson. You know, Israel has, this is all Courtney. Israel has, free healthcare. Who is paying for that? It's that's coming out of the wallets of Americans, and that's not the kind of we have spread ourselves too thin, that we are not taking care of our own citizens, and we are certainly not listening to their wants and desires. And so it would behoove us to look inward, not to isolate ourselves, but to kind of forward our American ability to thrive, stuff
Right.
like that.
Well, could I add one thing to that? And I think particularly when people criticize Quincy about this, I think that they confused multipolarity as a prescription and not a diagnosis.
Yeah,
That
Like,
no, well, hold on.
that's well said.
That's what I was gonna say. Is every time I mention multipolarity, I will have like someone say to me, "What are you? Are you like a Dugan supporter?" And I'm like,
right.
no, I don't like people. I don't like those kooks. I'm not like a cheerleader. I wouldn't call myself a cheerleader for multipolarity. I think it's going to lead to a lot of issues. I think there's a lot of risks associated with it. I think there's peril and promise to any kind of
Sure.
configuration, right? But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a multipolarity doesn't mean utopia.
Right.
But you're going to
Yeah.
have to, I think we're emerging into it. It's not
Yeah.
something we have a choice in, so you have to deal
Yeah.
with the reality of it. I hope that
That's
makes sense.
no, I
that,
think
I
that
think
no, I
that's
think
100%
that's exactly right.
correct, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree because like again, I think it's an emerging reality. It's not people are
Right.
not calling for multipolarity as the new system.
It's not,
They're
it's, yeah,
saying
it's
they're saying
diagnosis rather
it
than
is
prescription.
exactly that this is the reality of like America. Sure, we still have the, there's like the three legs of the American empire stool: military power, cultural power, monetary power. I think like we still certainly have the military power.
Yep.
I think you could argue the cultural power is waning. And then the monetary power is, I think, really where the question of like the emerging multipolar reality is that like China is like obviously a great economic competitor to the US, or you don't have to say competitor, it's just it has arrived as like it's somebody that could actually challenge America's dominance in the financial sphere over the world. And then you're seeing Trump like I think there's a lot to say about like what exactly he's trying to achieve via the tariff stuff, but he's very clearly like unwinding the global economic consensus like after the 90s or whatever. So there are other countries stepping in from a perspective of trade, of economic engagement, of development, obviously, when you're talking about China and the Belt and Road, that like other countries are just not aligning themselves under the American prerogative the way they did in the 90s and the early 2000s. And again, that's not to say that this is absolutely going to bring about a better next couple decades than the last few decades. I think we're in for some amount of conflict, and particularly like an unmanaged multipolarity can be really dangerous. That's why Quincy has this thing, the Better Order Project, which is about like trying to develop some amount of thought about like if the UN system doesn't work anymore, which it increasingly doesn't seem, it seems like it has its serious challenges. What does it look like to bring global great powers, middle powers, smaller nations to the table to talk about the shared challenges like climate change, like economic development that we can't solve alone, and certainly solving these challenges will fall to the wayside in an era of great power war. If we're fighting a war with China, the climate question is totally screwed. Like we need to cooperate, and part of that cooperation needs to be based on a shared understanding of reality, and that means that like America in various ways is not in a position long term to say we call the shots forever, which was what we imagined at the end of history. So yeah, I think there's just like a misunderstanding of what people are talking about.
That was well
again,
said.
Thanks.
The reason I brought that up is, and I promise we'll close after this, but my
Let's stay here
biggest
forever. I'm having fun.
but my biggest concern with multipolarity and an emerging multipolar world is, I mean, I think you could end up in a situation where bigger countries or great powers want to consolidate influence within their own region, and they see a smaller country within their sphere of influence, and they start, bullying. I think we're starting to see this kind of thing with Nagorno-Karabakh, some of Turkey's actions, and
Right.
just what's happening in general, even with what Israel is doing now, throwing its weight around and saying, well, we can just bomb Iran. We can do.
Right.
So that's my biggest concern. And in a way, I think Quincy is trying to address that. Like you said, an unmanaged multipolarity is going to be very bad.
Right.
Or it's very dangerous for smaller nations. I think it could be.
I think that's the emphasis. I think it's worst off for people at the bottom of the totem pole. Like, I think you could imagine the great powers getting by in a way that we did during the Cold War, and then everybody in the Cold War's killing fields was screwed because they became the site of proxy competition between the great powers, both economic and military. And so again, this is like an object of great concern, but like the thing that's absolutely not going to solve it is everybody putting their fingers in their ears and being like, this isn't happening. America's the guarantor of world freedom and peace forever and ever and ever. Stop talking about it.
That's the issue, because if I bring up that criticism of cheerleading multipolarity, people immediately think of that I'm defending unipolarity, which I don't think that's the option either.
I mean, this is just like a thesis that I'm throwing out there, but I feel like Ukraine is an example of the failures that America as the hegemon promises that things like the war in Ukraine wouldn't happen, or if that they did, they were going to come in and be the good guy and save everyone's asses. It didn't happen. Ukraine has been devastated. United States has to stop pretending that it has that capacity and that without diplomacy. And I think that's, has to be a part of looking forward. We have to recognize that military power itself is not going to solve all of our problems. It never has. And in fact, we have to treat nations with some degree of respect, or at least acknowledgement, right? Which is, talk about putting your fingers in your ears. People did that about Russia. Like, well, we'll just throw as many bombs at it as we possibly can. And instead, what we did was, kind of demolish an entire nation. So I think that is, an example of what's to come if we don't think seriously about the end of history, as some have put it.
Well, what do you guys have in the works for the Always at War podcast? And we'll close out on that.
Oh, wait. First, I have to say, I think I said Anna Kachayan instead of Anna Kasparian, which are two very different people.
I didn't even catch it.
Maybe I didn't, but I'm like, oh my God, did I just say Kachayan?
Oh, you did. That was a good catch.
And I wanted to just note that I know what I'm talking about. We are just having, pretty great time. We're building the show up on YouTube. It's very new. It's very exciting. I get to come in and answer questions that I've been long having, right? So about things like the multipolar world. Like, that is not something that I've had the opportunity to give, and this is so selfish, right? But like, I haven't had the time to kind of sit down and think about it seriously. And the podcast, I think, gives, like, if I'm an earnestly desiring to learn more about foreign policy, that's kind of how I imagine the podcast, right? So I get to ask these bigger questions, and we sit down and we kind of figure them out and talk about them. So some of our recent episode was actually with Daniel Besner from American Prestige, where we got to talk about kind of the culture of empire. I think one of my favorite episodes so far has been on Congress making money off the war machine. And we have a lot of great stuff to come. I think next we're going to talk about how the media kind of enforces a hegemonic narrative or pro-war narratives. And after that, I don't know, I think we're going to talk about the global south. Like, we have some really exciting and interesting topics, and they always come back to, why is America always at war? So if we're going to talk about the unipolar moment, we'll talk about how the unipolar moment kept us at war, and how maybe a future multipolar war world possibly could keep us out of one. And I just think it's really fun and really exciting. You should join us. I'm not always yelling like I did today, but
we need more yelling on the podcast.
I think sometimes.
No.
I'm just like I just woke up so angry at those votes. Like, I'll never forgive, Slotkin for not showing up. It's disgusting.
Just with all this Gaza stuff, I mean, next time we'll have to talk about the private contractors and how they tie into all of this.
Ooh,
Yeah, that's like a great episode, right? Like that.
Yeah,
kind of
we're
stuff
living
is
in
so
the long
interesting.
shadow of Blackwater.
Yeah,
most definitely.
definitely.
A very dark shadow. A very dark shadow. Courtney sold it very well. I don't have anything to add. She has been like the progenitor of this podcast and has done just such an awesome job helping us think through like an interesting way to do some storytelling about the realities of like the US warfare and the material and cultural incentives there that keep us always intervening. And so
Oh, thanks.
yeah, if you're interested, I mean it. You've done an awesome job. And I yeah, would encourage anybody who's enjoys Parallax Views like we do, to come check out
Definitely.
Always at War.
Yeah.
We're on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, JC, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y, Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.